This is StoryBeat, Storytellers on Storytelling, an exploration into how master storytellers and artists develop and build brilliant stories and works of art that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators of all kinds find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University in the heart of downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. Well, my guest today, Hollywood historian, researcher, writer, and archivist Barbara Hall, is a graduate of the USC School of Cinematic Arts and the University of Iowa. She was an archivist and oral historian at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences for more than 20 years. She's also worked as an archivist for Warner Brothers, the Writers Guild Foundation, and the Art Directors Guild. Barbara and my once and future StoryBeat guest, Rocky Lang, have recently collaborated on writing and publishing one of the most beautiful books on Hollywood I've ever seen. It's called Letters from Hollywood, and we'll discuss much more about it shortly. So for those reasons and many more, I'm truly delighted to welcome my first film archivist and historian to StoryBeat, Barbara Hall. Barbara, I'm so glad you could join me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to talking with you.
Oh, me too. I'm so glad you could. Okay, so let's start with your background. What was it that led you to pursue the life of being a historian and archivist in the first place?
Well, when I was a student at USC, I started taking some cinema history courses. I had always liked movies. I'd grown up watching movies with my family, old movies on TV. Mm-hmm. I remember being quite blown away by the movie That's Entertainment,
oh, yes.
which came out when I think I was about 12 or 13 years old.
Okay.
And seeing, all this nostalgia for old movies, getting a chance to see the clips from the old films that I hadn't seen before. And that made me a movie fan. Mm-hmm. And then when I got to USC, it didn't even occur to me that I might study that and move toward in that direction as a career.
What were you there to study? What did you think you were going to do?
I was a French major.
A French major? Actually.
Okay. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it, but I liked studying French, and so I was taking those classes. And then I took the introductory film studies course and really loved it. And then I started taking some other film history courses. And the professor who I really gravitated to there and who had a huge influence on me was named Rick Jewell. And he's retired now, but we're still very close. And he was a fantastic film history professor. And I took several of his courses. And after having done that, I decided to change my major over to cinema studies.
I see. This is as an undergraduate or graduate?
Yes, as an undergraduate. At USC.
Got it. And so you went from French to cinema and cinema history.
Yes.
All right, that's an interesting transition. Have you been able to use your learning about your knowledge about French and France and all that in terms of what you've done?
Not so much, because I really am focused on American cinema, and so I haven't really, and I haven't honestly continued to cultivate my French skills since I was in college. Mm-hmm. So I'm just as rusty as everyone else when I go to France. My French is not so great now, but. But I did get I got a degree in both. Actually, I did get the degree in French and a degree in cinema from what was then called the USC School of Cinema Television.
Yes.
And so that was a great experience. I saw so many movies and learned so much. And then my senior year, I had an opportunity to do I guess it was an internship at the American Film Institute library.
Right.
So I did that, and that eventually turned into a small part-time job, work-study type job, working at that library. So that was really my first experience having the chance to work at a library.
Got it.
And interestingly enough, one of the people I was working with there was Howard Prouty. And Howard later came to work at the Academy. We worked together for many years and are good friends. And he also got to know Rocky Lang over at the AFI. And eventually Howard was the person who sort of instigated the idea for our book by sending Rocky a letter that he came across from Rocky's dad that was written in 1939.
Got it. Well, so that's good. You've leapt ahead into my questions a little bit. That's perfectly fine. And by the way, I am a fellow Trojan. I graduated from USC in the theater department. So
great. So it's a good theater department for sure.
It's a very good theater school.
Absolutely. No, it was a great experience. So as I said, I learned so much. I had this opportunity to have a job at the AFI. And then not long after I graduated, I heard about a job that was coming available at the Margaret Herrick Library, which is the library of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Mm-hmm. So I went in and applied for that job and was lucky enough to be given the opportunity to work with Sam Gill, who was their special collections archivist at the time. And the staff it was a much smaller operation then than it is now. This was in 1983.
This is when it was on Wilshire Boulevard,
right? It was a much smaller staff.
This is when it was on Wilshire.
So I really got an opportunity almost right away as this young student just out of college to really get some hands-on experience working with the collections there at the Academy. And that's really when I realized that this was the career path that I wanted to take.
Right. This was when the Academy was when the library was in the Academy building on Wilshire, right?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. But it was also around the time when they had really started to increase the size of their collections and had gotten some very important donations. So right around the time that I started there, they were given the Motion Picture Association of America Production Code Administration files, which was a huge collection of over 20,000 files that had been donated. So most of that was stored in a storage facility across the street. So I actually spent a fair amount of my time over there across the street working with the collection. I was the first person to sit down and make a list of all the files that were in the collection. And of course, being 1983, I did that by writing all the names down on a yellow pad and then taking them back to the library and typing the list up on a typewriter.
So were you always, going way back even before you found yourself at USC, were you always a big reader of history?
I did really like history. I liked studying that in school, and I did like reading it. I came from a family. My father was someone who was always reading a book. That's how I always remember him. So I think it was just in my genes. And, I also was always interested in my family's history and hearing about what had come before in my family. Mm-hmm. So, I think there's always been something that has fascinated me about looking at the past.
Were there any particular historians that you admired then or continue to admire now, especially in the world of film? Or are you sort of at the frontier edge of it?
Oh no, I'm not at the frontier edge of it at all. I mean, there's been so many important film historians who have paved the way for the work that's being done now.
So for instance, who?
People like David Boardwell, who's a very important professor who teaches at the University of Wisconsin.
Okay, so Barbara, just so you're aware of this little fact, I spent my first 3 years in college at the University of Wisconsin, and I was a student of David Boardwell's.
Oh wow! Well, I don't know that I've ever met him in person, but I definitely admire his work.
Yeah.
And also people like Kevin Brownlow. All of the. There's been so many great historians. And then I had an opportunity, to eventually meet a lot of these people and work with them as well. And so everyone that I met when I was working as an archivist, all these different historians that I had a chance to work with really had an influence on me as well.
What would you say are your, do you have a favorite Hollywood-centric book that has always been an inspiration for you? Is there, one author that really inspires you? Aside from Boardwell, obviously.
That's a good question. I'm glancing over at my bookshelves here. I do really admire Kevin Brownlow's work because he did go back and interview so many people who worked, in particular in the silent period, to get their first, their own first-person recollections, and to put the history together that way, which is something that I also ended up doing during my career. So I really do admire him as one of the film historians who has really had a huge impact.
All right, so I'm curious about, and I have a funny feeling I know what you're going to say, but let's hear it anyway, that when you are doing your work, it's probably fairly patient, it requires a lot of patience, and it's fairly tedious work. Am I correct?
I don't consider it tedious,
so
but it is. It does take a long. You do have to have a lot of patience because sometimes you're going through a lot of material looking for just the right thing, and there's a lot of other stuff you have to look through. But on the other hand, sometimes that's when you find the most wonderful, unexpected things, when you're looking for one thing and you come across something else.
Right.
So to me, it's exciting, but it does take a lot of patience.
It's a little bit like a kind of a treasure hunt all the time, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And that's what I enjoyed when I was working at the Academy in the Special Collections Department, and having a chance to work with film historians, scholars, film students, biographers, because you're sort of helping, you're kind of their guide on their treasure hunt. And you have a chance to point them in a certain direction or bring something out that they hadn't thought about looking, that they didn't know was there. And sometimes it can be really exciting when you find something that one thing, that someone's been looking for.
How important is it to the life of an archivist and a historian? How important is being a good writer if you're not planning to be a published writer? Is it super important?
I don't know. I mean, I've always loved writing, and so I was, very, but never had a chance to do a book, or had really had an idea about doing a book. So I was very fortunate that Rocky reached out to me, and we ended up collaborating on this because it's my first book.
Got it.
But I don't know that. I mean, in some ways, it's important to be a good writer when you're an archivist, just because you do often have to write people emails or letters explaining, what materials you have, and also you have to promote your collections. So there's a certain amount of writing involved in writing descriptions of the collections and knowing what things are important and how to draw those things out. Sometimes archivists work on exhibits, so there might be writing involved with that as well. But in a lot of the work that archivists do is not necessarily related to writing.
Well,
a lot of it is it's organizing and describing things. I mean, you do have to be for instance, my husband is an archivist at the Academy's library, and he has worked there for almost 40 years.
Wow.
And what he does is he goes through the collections that the Academy has, and he describes them. He inventories them, or that creates the finding aids. And in the course of that, he describes what's in each folder in each collection.
Right.
So you do need to have a certain amount of skill to be good at doing that. Identifying what the important things are and figuring out how to describe them in a way that will make them accessible to researchers, or help researchers recognize that this is a particular folder of material that they want to look at.
It's being a clear communicator one way or another.
Absolutely.
Okay,
yeah.
Good. So we bring up the book, so we're now just going to dive in and talk about the book.
Okay.
All right. So Rocky contacts you. You didn't contact Rocky, correct?
Right. Rocky heard about me from Howard Prouty, who I mentioned earlier, who was a mutual friend of ours who works at the Academy.
Okay. So were you, aside from looking at all sorts of different things in an archive, especially the Hollywood archives, were you someone who knew and loved letters to begin with? Were letters something that were important to you?
Actually, Actually, they were. In all those years working at the Academy Library and getting an opportunity to familiarize myself with all of the collections that they have there, and they have, that we used a lot of different libraries to do our research for this, but the Academy really is the crown jewel
of
film research libraries. And in having the opportunity to work with that material over the years, I had seen a tremendous number of letters that were in the collections, and I just was always drawn to them. There's something about, I think I'm really, because there's all different kinds of documentation in the archives, but there's something about the personal nature of a letter and the fact that it is from one particular person's point of view that always interested me. And even with my family, I've always been interested in if I come across a cache of old letters that my grandfather wrote or something like that. I've always been fascinated by those. So I think there is something special about letters that always appealed to me.
I agree.
So that was why I was really excited when Rocky contacted me about this project, because I thought it was a great idea.
Well, I agree. I think there's something very special about letters in general that we are tending to lose in our current society. Are you an inveterate letter writer? Do you still write letters to people?
I do not write very many letters anymore, although I'm one of those people whose emails, I think, read more like letters. Like,
right.
I don't write, like, really short, little cryptic emails. My emails tend to have, like, paragraphs and things like that. So I think I'm continuing that tradition a little bit, but I do not put pen to paper or put paper in a typewriter and still write letters.
And clearly in this book you focused. There are two. I think there are two. There may be more than two, but I think the two big categories of letter writing that people think about are personal letters and business letters. And these are mostly personal letters, but in some ways they're in business letters, but they're very personal. And I found that mixture very interesting.
Yes, I think both Rocky and I felt that that was something we wanted to capture because we'd noticed that, and I don't know, I suspect that it's much more common in Hollywood, in the Hollywood film industry, for personal and professional matters to kind of overlap. So you do see that in a lot of our letters, that the person writing the letter is writing to a friend who also happens to be someone they're working with on a picture.
Right. There are many of those in this book. I mean, and the way that you put that together is, I think, really wonderful to see. Would you say, I want to just talk about today for just a half a beat, and that is, do you think that there will become a day when books are written about the history of emailing and tweeting? I do think that. I think it's inevitable that there'll be books written about it, but it won't. I don't know if it'll be a celebration of letter writing the way our book is, or if it'll be more of a critique of what happened during this time. It'll be interesting to see. So, but I do think it's too bad that there's something being lost. I agree.
That it's not just the format, not just the fact that it's electronic, but it's also just the way we communicate with each other. It's in small bursts. You're not sitting down and thinking about an overall letter that you want to write to someone to communicate a bunch of different ideas. Everything kind of comes in small pieces.
Indeed.
Now, the other problem, of course, is going to be archiving this material. I mean, digital archivists and other people who work in the archives field are trying to figure out how to archive all this material. Born digital files, they're having to see if they can save these onto different servers and how we can make those last, because otherwise, a whole generation of communication is going to be lost. Not just about Hollywood, but everything. Industry. Yeah. So it's very challenging. In some ways, it's funny. It's the opposite of what people think, but in some ways, it's easier to archive a piece of paper than it is to archive a digital file.
Why is that?
Well, because digital files can get corrupted. You might save them into a certain format, and that format later becomes obsolete. and or or you don't have, you save it on. Say you archived all your emails in the 90s onto floppy disks. Then when you go to give them to a library and say all my emails are on here, they may not have a machine that can read a floppy disk.
I know.
So then they have to figure out how to transfer that material onto some kind of format that they can read.
I have
There's
floppy.
just a lot of different.
I was going to say I have floppy disks going all the way back into the mid 1980s, and I can't read any of them anymore.
Right, exactly. So there's a lot of challenges with that. Whereas if you have a letter and you put it in, it makes its way to an archive and it gets placed in an acid-free folder and in a box and in a proper environment for storing materials like that.
Mm-hmm.
It can last 100 years or more.
Well, they've certainly found documents that are hundreds of years old, right? I mean, books.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's
and with
for
the
sure.
film industry, we're only talking. We're a relatively young industry. We're only talking about around now about 125 years of history that we have.
Right, and really the bulk of it is 100 years, 110. The very early stuff is there wasn't that much going on compared to what started to happen in the 1920s, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it was pretty active in the teens here in Hollywood too, and also in other countries as well. But yeah, the 1920s is really when Hollywood kind of really took off.
Yes, indeed. So, all right, about how long did it take you to pull all the letters that you wanted to use together? What was the length of time overall?
Rocky and I first met just about 3 years ago, and started talking about the idea, and then did our book proposal. Rocky's agent was able to sell the book proposal pretty quickly to Abrams Books, which turned out to be very, very fortunate for us because they were terrific, and I think they did a beautiful job on the book. So that was in early 2017, and then I would say the research process probably went on for about a year or so. I started spending time at the Academy Library, but also did research at other libraries here in Southern California. Rocky was also doing some research, and in particular looking for letters from private collections and contacting friends of his and other people that he knows in the industry to see if we could find some letters that way as well. So that was sort of an intensive period of maybe about a year or so. And then, of course, we had to start getting the permissions, which Rocky pretty much handled, and then writing about each letter, figuring out what we were going to, selecting the letters from the large number that we accumulated.
What was the total number that you accumulated before you started paring it down?
I don't have I never counted the total, but I would say we probably, I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds of things I looked at. I didn't get photocopies of everything or take pictures of every single thing that I found, that I saw. But in terms of getting actual copies, things that were under consideration, I would say probably 500.
Wow.
5 maybe.
And how many made the cut?
And then we narrowed it down to the 135, 137 that are in the book.
And how many do you think about that you just wish that you had room for? How many were of those?
There were some. Every so often, I'll remember one that I really liked that I wish we could have gotten in. But so that would have been nice. But I do think that Abrams made the compromise that we came to on the number of letters has worked out pretty well. I think it feels like a hefty number. Without the book becoming just too overwhelming.
All right, so I'm holding the book in my hand as we talk, and it's a beautifully done, oversized hardback coffee table book, and the pages are beautiful. It's about 350 plus pages, and it's a hefty book. It's not. If you put another 100 pages in here, it'd probably be too heavy. It's and the style and the way that it's put together, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, but it's exquisitely assembled, the assembly of the book is as impressive as everything else, because that's what keeps you compelled to keep forging forward as you're looking. It's not just the letters themselves, which are very interesting to read, but there's also lots of photographs in here, and the way that you've laid the book out is fantastic. Were you involved in the layout of the book, or did somebody else do that?
No, Abrams assigned a designer to the book, and I think he did a tremendous job.
Tremendous.
And our editor, I think, also had some influence on that. But we were seeing some early layouts, and were able to give some input. I mean, for me, the most important thing about the design of the book. Well, there were a couple of things. I mean, early on, Rocky and I agreed that we really wanted to do a book that reproduced the letters. So we did think that the material we were finding was really interesting, but it was also important to us for people to see the letters.
I agree.
Yeah, and that was important to me as someone who's worked in archives, because I felt like other than the historians and students who have an opportunity to go to archives and study these, see these kinds of materials in person, I thought that there were a lot of people who didn't realize how much amazing material had been saved from the history of Hollywood,
right? And
that these kinds of letters existed. So I really like the idea of the book as a way to give people sort of a look at what it's like to look at materials in an archive.
I agree with one of the really great assets of this book is that you are looking at the actual letters. Well, of course, you're not looking at the true in real life letter, but you're looking at reproductions of the real letters. So you're seeing handwriting, you're seeing notes, you're seeing coffee stains, you're seeing all kinds of things on these letters that make them come to life. It feels much more real this way. All right, so what was the process like for you and Rocky to decide, okay, we've got 500 plus letters, we need 135. What was that process like? How did you make those decisions?
Well, from the very beginning, we had agreed that the way to arrange the letters in the book was to put them in chronological order, because even though I knew that it was to some extent going to be about each individual letter, and each one was going to be about that person who wrote the letter, we really wanted to see if we could create some kind of a historical timeline of Hollywood in a way. And we knew it wouldn't cover every single. It's not a history of film.
Right.
It's not meant to be a book that's a history of the entire film industry.
Definitely
but we
not.
wanted to see if we could kind of find letters that touched on a lot of important issues and a lot of important films that were made during that time that we were covering, from the 1920s to the 1970s. So we put everything in chronological order, and then just started going through and trying to see which letters worked well together and which ones had something to say about something that was going on in the industry at that particular time.
I think that's the way you just said that is quite accurate and well considered. That this is not a history of Hollywood book. This is a captures the flavor of the times as things moved on.
Right. Also, as you mentioned earlier, there were we tried to balance. I think we always had a lot of different things in our minds. I mean, we wanted to have, obviously, and it was important to have a lot of recognizable names in the book, people that would be recognizable to movie fans and film historians. But we also wanted to have people from a lot of different crafts. Not just movie stars and not just directors and writers, but also cinematographers and art directors and agents and producers. So that was one consideration, is trying to get a variety of people.
Mm-hmm.
I also was interested in getting people at different stages in their careers. So I really liked, for instance, the letter from Rocky's dad, Jennings Lang, was written when he was 24 years old and trying to break into the business.
Right.
And then we have other letters that are written when people are toward the ends of their careers. So I kind of looked for that. And I looked, as I said earlier, I looked for letters that had kind of an interesting point of view on some significant aspect of film, of the film industry or of film history. For instance, the letter from Ronald Coleman from 1928, where he says he doesn't want to perform in front of a microphone because he thinks that that the sound business, I think as he calls it, is a kind of a passing fad. I thought that was a very interesting way to talk about the transition to sound in Hollywood.
I think that's one of the more fascinating letters in the book, is that here you've got a man who actually had a beautiful voice thinking that sound was not going to work. And that just shows you that people just don't understand how technology keeps forging ahead. And we've already talked about that.
Exactly. Yeah, and that was an example also of a letter. Speaking of what the letters looked like, I mean, that's probably the one of the harder letters to read in the book. It's some kind of ancient photostat or something, but it was the only copy of that letter that I was able to find in the Samuel Goldwyn collection, which is where it's located. I tried to talk to the archives people there, the archivists there, about finding the original, and we were not able to locate it, so we decided to forge ahead using that photostat because I thought it was such an interesting letter. And, it kind of shows a little bit of a reality of what it's like to do research in archives also, which is that sometimes you are looking at photostats, photocopies, carbons. You don't always find the pristine, beautiful original.
Right. Well, the one that I'm looking at it right now, the letter, and it has a sepia tone quality to it. It definitely looks like a photostat, and it's this line that just is, it's in retrospect kind of hilarious when he says, Ronald Colman says, with reference to the additional clause of the contract, I would rather not sign this at any rate just at present, except as a scientific achievement. I'm not sympathetic to this, quote, sound, closed quote, business. That's hilarious, that's the way he thought.
Yeah. No, I really thought that was great when I came across it. Because it confirms something that historians have written about, but also that's, entrenched in popular culture, for instance, in the movie Singin' in the Rain, that there were a lot of, there were a lot of actors and other creative people who were afraid that, that sound was going to be a negative development for.
Well, for some of them it was a negative.
Art.
For some of them it was a negative development because they didn't have good voices, but they looked a certain way. So yeah, that was important for some of the. It was fear, of course. It's always fear, isn't it? But that I think that the fact that this man who was a very good-looking star and also had a beautiful voice was afraid of sound. I think that's kind of amusing. All right, so you talked about clearances a little bit earlier. Did you have to clear every single one of these letters?
Well, some of them are in the public domain.
Okay.
Because according to the copyright laws, after a certain amount of time has passed, in the case of unpublished material, it's the life of the author plus 70 years.
Right.
So anything was written by someone who died before 1949 would be in the public domain.
Got it.
So we did not have to clear those. But there's only a handful of those in the book. And everything else, we did make every attempt to clear. And Rocky, I think, did a remarkable job of tracking down the family members and estates of the people whose letters are included in the book. And as he can tell you when you talk with him, this led to some wonderful friendships and wonderful discoveries about the families of the people, who were these, titans in Hollywood.
Well, I see online that Rocky, and I guess you too, recently were interacting with Bela Lugosi Jr. and Sarah Karloff, and so just that those two families alone are enough to, raise the roof for some people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it was great. We were out in Flint Ridge, here in California, last weekend, and Mr. Lugosi came and read his father's letter.
Wow.
To the crowd and answered questions about his dad. It was quite a great evening.
I imagine it was. All right, so would you say there were criterion for letters that you knew were not going in the book? were there I assume there was criterion, you've already said so, for why a letter might go in the book, but were there things that you definitely said, we're not putting anything like that in the book?
Well, we weren't looking for dirt
Okay.
necessarily, and we weren't looking for scandal. I mean, if we found, something interesting that touched on something scandalous, that might have been okay, but we weren't going to put in anything scandalous just for scandal's sake. And in that sense, for one thing, it might have been, we do need to get the permission from the letter writer's family. So, in some cases, they probably wouldn't have wanted letters like that to be in the book. But also that just wasn't the kind of book that we were trying to do. We really wanted to try and capture what the relationships were like in Hollywood and what it was like to work in Hollywood and live here, and not necessarily focus on the scandals.
Right.
And even when we do have something in the book that's related to something scandalous, for instance, well, it's not really scandalous, it's more sad, but the telegram about Frances Farmer, again, I think it's just a sort of an interesting, unusual take on what happened to her, and it's not so much about the sort of lurid side of her problems and
yes,
her
because
mental health.
She certainly had big problems, and no, it is kind of a sad telegram, as you say, and more so than a takedown of her or put down of her or anything like that. It's just a sad moment, but I think it's an important moment because that sort of thing was more or less swept under the rug in the old Hollywood. Yes? Yeah.
Well, her arrest and everything that happened to her around the time this telegram was written was covered extensiving in the press, and her picture was in the paper and jail and everything. And then she was, it covered her being institutionalized at a mental facility and everything. So it really was splashed across the paper. But and then like most things in Hollywood, it died down and people forgot about her.
Of course.
But yeah, it was. I thought it was interesting to kind of get a sense of how her friends in Hollywood and her colleagues were hoping to help her.
Well, I'm not sure that there's a good answer for what I'm about to ask you, but nevertheless, I'm curious if you think there are common themes throughout this book.
One of the things I've always liked about studying film history is that the industry has evolved in a lot of ways, but also has stayed the same. And I feel like there are a lot of letters in here that show that the concerns that people had about making films, the issue of sort of art versus commerce,
yes,
and money and image, that a lot of these concerns have stayed the same over the last 100 years. So, maybe that's sort of a theme that continues through the book. Otherwise, I did feel like we tried to really kind of cast a wide net. We weren't really necessarily looking for a theme that would run through the book. It's certainly something I thought about at the beginning and wondered if there was a way I could do that. But in the end, I felt like that would be too difficult and would maybe might result in our, leaving out some letters that didn't fit in with that theme, if you know what I mean.
I do.
So we decided to just kind of make it a broader look at Hollywood.
All right.
But I do really like little connections that you see between some of the letters.
I think so.
You see these different letters related to Hedda Hopper, for instance, that run through the book,
right.
Or you have a letter from Alan Ladd, and then a few pages later you have a letter from Sal Mineo, and then there's a picture of Sal Mineo from Rebel Without a Cause, and he has a picture of Alan Ladd in his locker. Little things like that. We kind of, I kind of get some joy out of.
So let's talk about the pictures for a moment. This book is full of not just the reproductions of actual letters, but you've got lots of incredible photos in here, some of which I've never seen before, and I've seen a lot of Hollywood pictures. Where did you get all these pictures? Did these come out of the Academy as well?
Some of them did, and some of them were photos that I was familiar with from having my time there, but also they have just an incredible photo archive that is working really hard to make their materials accessible. They have a really good digital photo archive now where you can look at their a lot of their materials, and also just going through the photo files there. So some of them were from there, but we used a lot of different sources. It was interesting, actually. We weren't always sure how much we were going to use photos in the book. Our editor felt that the letters alone would kind of, would be able to carry most of the, sort of graphic design for the book. But then kind of late in the process, they came back to us and said, we really feel like we should put some photos, integrate some photos into the book as well. So we had to kind of start doing the photo research a little bit toward the end of the process. And so we went to the Academy. We also used some, photo archives like Getty and Photofest, and just went on and explored their archives. And I think we both had really specific ideas about the photos, in that we really wanted them to relate to the letters.
Right.
We didn't put any photos in that was purely just for visual.
Totally
visual
true.
candy. We really
totally
wanted
true.
them to relate to the letters.
Totally true. All of the photos in here relate to the letters. It's all tied together. I'm looking at one of my favorite pictures in the book, which is attached to one of my favorite letters in the book, and it's this incredible picture of John Huston sitting on the edge of a chair, on the arm of a chair, looking over, I guess, script pages for Moby Dick with Ray Bradbury, who's absolutely, for my money, is one of the greatest writers who's ever lived. And to read Ray Bradbury's letter to John Huston, and to see Ray Bradbury's sort of insecurity about the whole thing is amazing. Mm-hmm. And this is one of our greatest writers ever.
Yes, but he as you probably know, if you've because he wrote a lot about this in I think his own work subsequently.
Yes.
He admired Huston so much, but then it turned out to be a very sort of
contentious,
fractious relationship as they worked on that.
Well, John Huston was never known as the easiest person to work with. So
right.
That's
right.
No surprise, and I would think that I had the good fortune to meet Ray Bradbury more than once, and he was just a very sweet, gentle person. So if he was butting heads with this cantankerous guy, it probably didn't work out so well.
Right. It was. Yeah, Huston was definitely bigger than life.
Oh, definitely.
But yeah, I loved. That was an example of one where it was pretty. It was hard to choose which letter to use, because there's a number of letters from Ray Bradbury to Huston in that collection at the Academy.
Right.
And that was one of the things we decided early on, was that we would only have one letter pretty much just have one letter per person in the book. That way we would be able to get more voices, a wider range of perspective, because otherwise, there's, you could put in 4 or 5 different letters from Ray Bradbury and sort of trace that relationship. Mm-hmm. But we decided that we really wanted to just try and pick one to represent. So that was challenging sometimes, especially with people like Ray Bradbury or Huston himself. There's many, many fantastic letters written by him in different collections, but we decided to just focus in on one.
Well, perhaps this will be a gigantic smash hit, which I wish for you, and you'll be able to do a second book.
Maybe so. We've had a lot of people ask us about that, but we haven't really given it much thought.
Yeah, well,
but, we're just thrilled that people are responding so well to this book.
Sure.
We are kind of amazed that it's getting the attention that it is.
I'm delighted that you also included a number of letters in here that are about censorship and the way that went down in the history of Hollywood, and the Breen office and Hayes office and so on, and that you show. I'm glad that you show that in here, because I think people need to be reminded of that was not a particularly happy part of the history of Hollywood, that there was so much censorship at one time.
Yeah, that's true. And as I mentioned when we first started talking a while ago, I was first introduced to the Production Code Administration collection when I worked at the Academy right out of college. So I was actually one of the very first people to start going through those files when they came to the library. So I've always been fascinated with that topic, and so it was very important to me to get several letters related to that into the book. I mean, you could do 5 books with just the letters that are in that collection.
I'm sure.
I mean, it's pretty remarkable.
I'm sure.
So it was really hard to just choose a few, but we definitely did want to make that a part of it because it's such an important part of the fabric of the history of Hollywood.
All right,
the movies that were made would not be the same if the production code had not been part of the equation.
I think that's right, and I think what we then came to was a reaction to that code. And so, yes, the code is an important part of the history, and so that's why I'm glad you included those in here and didn't leave them out. Do you have a favorite letter from this book? Is there one that just is like, this is my favorite letter?
We've been working on this project for so long. They all are a little bit like my children,
yes,
to some extent. But so there's a lot of them that I could call my favorites for different reasons. But I guess one of the ones that I really like a lot is the letter from the actor Louis Calhern written to his friends Leonard and Sylvia Lyons. Leonard Lyons was a columnist,
right?
And he's writing about what it's like. Writing a humorous letter about what it's like to live in Hollywood and work in the Hollywood studio system. At that point, he was working for MGM, and he writes about. So he's writing about Hollywood as a place, but he's also writing about working within the Hollywood system. And it's just a very funny letter and so self-deprecating. I mean, he was a terrific actor, but he's sort of making fun of himself and making fun of the Hollywood studio system. And so that's one of my favorites.
Well, that's so I'm going to tell you my 2 favorite.
Okay.
Just so you know. I'm just bowled over by, and let me just go pluck it out of here real quick if I can. It's on, okay, I've got it. It's Cubby Broccoli to Harry Saltzman. It's the shortest letter in the book. It's only one line, and the whole letter is, Blumoff, whoever that is, reports New York did not care for Connery, feels we can do better. Now, that is just flat out marvelous. That's marvelous. I mean, one of the biggest superstars we've ever had in the history of movies and the biggest series we've ever had in the history of movies, James Bond series, one letter they were about to blow Sean Connery off of the picture. Yeah,
I know. That's a great one. That was one that Rocky tracked down by contacting Eon Productions, which is the company that owned by the Broccolis that still, makes the James Bond films.
Sure.
They have their own archive, and they sent us a few things to look at, and that was one of them. And obviously, when we saw that, we realized that would be a great thing to include in the book.
Oh, I just adore that. When I saw that, I just almost fell out of my chair. That's like it reminds me very much of the famous screen test of Fred Astaire, which I can't quote, but I can paraphrase, and I think you know what I'm talking about, where the screen test of Fred Astaire says, dances a little, sings a bit, or whatever it says, and it's basically a pass on Fred Astaire. So,
I have seen that. Yeah, in a way, it's interesting. Things like that telex about Sean Connery, and also the different telegrams that we have in the book. I guess those are the closest that we have to the way we communicate today. They're a little bit more like tweets or emails, I guess, than actual full-fledged letters. So it does show that there was even a sort of a form of communication at the time that was a little bit similar to what we do now, which is just something where you just want to get the information in there. It's not so much about crafting a beautiful letter, but just about sending the key information.
Absolutely. Second favorite letter, because I love many of them, but my second favorite letter is the Tom Hanks to George Roy Hill. Before Tom Hanks, he was just a boy, basically. And he writes a letter to George Roy Hill, who's I think forgotten today largely, but one of the best directors we've ever had. And he's basically telling him that he should become a star and George Roy Hill should make him a star. I mean, it's essentially what the letter is. And how does that work out? Well, George Roy Hill doesn't make him a star, but Tom Hanks becomes one of the biggest stars ever. That's just marvelous stuff.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful letter. That's one that I was familiar with from the Academy. I think actually my husband, who cataloged the George Roy Hill papers, was the first person to come across that letter. I remember when he found it and took it to the library director to sort of say, hey, take a look at this. So I remember when that happened many years ago. And I'm so glad that we were able to include it in the book. And again, I think that's another one where the opportunity to actually see the letter in his handwriting on that lined paper that we all used when we were in high school.
Yes.
I think that adds so much to it, much more than just reading the words. To actually see what the letter looks like, I think it makes all the difference.
And you can see how carefully he wrote it, and he comes up with his own word "bango," and this is just marvelous stuff. I hope you do sell enough of these that justifies another version. Was there one eureka moment in this whole process? Was there, or were there many? Was there a good eureka moment, like we found something we really were looking for?
I mean, there's, we were lucky enough to find so many remarkable letters. As I said, some that I sort of knew about, but a lot that I wasn't expecting to find. I guess one that was sort of a eureka moment for me was the letter that I came across when I was at down in Texas at the Harry Ransom Center, which is this amazing archive of personal papers and correspondence and manuscripts at the University of Texas. And I was going through the papers of Myron Selznick, who was an agent, and of course the brother of David O. Selznick.
Right.
And I came across this letter from Alfred Hitchcock, and that was sort of a eureka moment for me, because it's such a charming letter written at such an important moment in his life when he's moving from England to America to become a director to do his first film here, Rebecca, and it really just captures, I think, his personality. And I was very excited by that because I had worked with the Alfred Hitchcock papers, which are at the Academy. That was another collection I worked on. I was very lucky. So I got to work on that when I was first at the Academy. And I remembered, and then over the years, helped many. That's one of the most popular collections at the Academy, as you can imagine, and worked with many scholars and film historians who came in to look at that material. But I remembered that there really weren't that many letters from Hitchcock in the collection. I think a lot of the personal ones, like between him and his wife and the family members, were probably kept by the family. But in terms of other kinds of letters, you just don't see that many from Hitchcock. They tend to be very, very brief, the ones that I had seen, and I hadn't seen anything quite like this. I just think it really is charming and reveals his personality. So I was very excited to find that. And then I was able to had met members of the family before, so I was able to get in touch with them and get permission to use the letter.
Well, you're talking about this letter that was written in 1939 to Daniel Darieux, or he means Winkler. It's to Daniel Winkler.
That's right, and he's teasingly telling them to help him find a place to live. To ride on their bicycle up to Bel Air and all kinds of things. And as I mentioned in the caption that I wrote to go with it, I saw subsequent memos and letters about this, and they just loved it. They were so thrilled, and they talk about, I think I quote from it, something about, we went around the office to show your letter to everyone and things like that. So I just thought it was so super charming and sort of revealed a side of his personality that you don't always see.
Well, that is the charm of it, is that you're seeing a side of Hitchcock that you would not even think that was there. That he's talking about his personal life and he needs a place to live, and it's sort of very brings him down to become more of a human than the god that he's become.
Right, exactly. And then, I believe I found the photo that accompanies it with Photofest in New York. And I just love that photo because it shows him and his family and arriving in Los Angeles. So it just was a perfect fit.
It's a marvelous picture. So yeah, I'm looking at it right now. It's a really fantastic picture. Well, Barbara, we've been talking for almost an hour, and we're going to wind this show down. I just was curious if you have a good piece of advice or a tip for those who might be interested in getting into the business of being a film historian or an archivist or even a book writer, as you've now become. Do you have a piece of advice or a tip that people could use?
Well, I mean, I guess this will sound, this is not very original, but I mean, I think it's so important to be passionate about what you do and to really believe in what you're doing. Even if it seems like a topic that maybe not everyone would be interested in. If you really believe in it and you can put the time in and do the research, I think it's possible to take any topic and make it interesting to other people if you have that commitment. And in terms of being an archivist, I mean, I was very lucky. I kind of came into it through a background in film history and film studies. Nowadays, most archivists come out of library and information science programs. It's the field has become very professionalized, which is great. So if someone wants to become an archivist, they should explore those kinds of programs in order to go get into that field. But in terms of film history, again, my other advice is just watch as many movies as you possibly can.
Oh, for sure.
And read as much about it as you can, and try and go back and put yourself in the place. What we try to do with this book, try to go back and put yourself in the shoes of the people who were making the films and see things through their eyes. I think
that's not advice I hear too often on this show, so it's uncommon advice, which is very good. And I couldn't agree with you more that what's happening with our diversification of the entertainment industry is that we're losing people understanding the totality of the history of where this comes from. And I see it in the students that I teach, because I teach screenwriting here in Pittsburgh, and I see it in the students when you mention very, very famous stars' names and they look at you with a blank stare. They have no idea who you're talking about, and these are film students. So I agree that that's a very good piece of advice, that you must study the history of where it comes from. And what more pleasurable way to study anything would it be than to watch movies? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a total joy. So I agree. I think that's a very wise piece of advice. Barbara, this has been a terrific and fascinating hour, and I truly appreciate your coming on StoryBeat today, and I wish you extremely well with this book. Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking with you about it. It's been very exciting to connect with people over the letters that we were able to put in the book. And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great episodes to you. This podcast would not have been possible without the generous support of the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.